Right now, there are more than 8 billion humans on this planet. We're in every climate, on every continent, at the bottom of the ocean, and above the sky. We are, by any measure, the most dominant large animal that has ever lived. So, here's a fact that should not fit inside that story. Around 900,000 years ago, the entire population of our ancestors, every single human-like being carrying that line that leads to you, collapsed to roughly 1,280 individuals capable of having children. 1,280. That's not a country. That's not a city. There's fewer people that fit in a large wedding, a small town high school, one apartment building. That was, as far as we can tell, almost everyone. The whole future of the human race standing on a knife's edge in a group you could photograph. And it wasn't a bad year. It wasn't a rough decade. According to the genetic evidence, our ancestors stayed trapped at that razor-thin number for around 117,000 years, for longer than modern humans have even existed. The line that becomes us was hanging by a thread. One bad drought, one hard winter, one unlucky generation away from ending completely. You exist because that thread did not snap. And the strangest part is where we found the evidence. Not in bones, not in a mass grave, but in the blood of people walking around today. In your DNA right now, there's a scar from the day humanity almost ended. Let me show you how to read it. We throw around numbers like endangered without really feeling them. So let's make this one real. Today, a species is considered critically endangered, one step from extinction, when its numbers drop into the low thousands or hundreds. Mountain gorillas, certain tigers, animals we build an entire global conservation effort around. Animals we put on posters and fight in courts to save because we're terrified of losing them. At the bottom of this ancient crash, our own ancestors were rarer than that. If a wildlife biologist today found a large primate with around 1,280 breeding adults left on this earth, spread thin across a hostile landscape, they would call it a species on the brink. They would say it might not make it. And that was us. That was the entire human population. Not a thriving species spreading across the world, but a scattered, fragile handful clinging on. And think about how vulnerable a group that small actually is. With so few individuals, a single disease could tear through most of them. Drought that dries up the wrong river could starve them. A run of bad luck, too few children, too many deaths, and the whole line quietly disappears. The way thousands of other human-like species did disappear, leaving nothing but a few bones for us to puzzle together. For over 100,000 years, that was daily reality, not dominance, not destiny, just barely holding on. So, how do we know any of this happened? Nobody was there to count. There's no ancient census. The answer is one of the most beautiful tricks in all of science, and it's hiding inside every person you have ever met. Your DNA is not just a blueprint for your body. It's a record, a document written over hundreds of thousands of years, copied and passed down from parent to child, generation after generation, all the way back in time. And every so often, that document picks up a tiny change, a mutation. Most are harmless. They just sit there, getting copied along with everything else. Because these changes happen at a fairly steady rate over time, scientists can use them like a clock. They count the differences between people, and you can estimate how long ago their lineages split, and roughly how many ancestors there were along the way. Here's the key idea. A large, healthy population carries a huge amount of genetic variety, lots of different versions of genes, because there are lots of different people mixing over time. But when a population crashes down to almost nothing, most of that variety is wiped out. Only a handful of survivors' DNA gets passed on, and that loss leaves a permanent mark. A kind of genetic silence that stays visible in their descendants for hundreds of thousands of years afterward. In 2023, a team of scientists published a study in the Journal of Science using a new, powerful method to read that history out of modern human DNA. They ran the genetic clock backwards, and when they looked at the deep past, the numbers pointed to something dramatic, a severe crash, right around 900,000 years ago when the breeding population plunged to about 1,280 and stayed crushed down for roughly 117,000 years before slowly recovering. And nobody dug up a single skeleton to find this. They read it in living people. Catastrophe was recorded in us, passed down silently in the code that built your body. You've been carrying the memory of this near extinction your entire life without even knowing it. Which leaves the obvious question, what happened? What could push a whole species of clever, tool-using, fire-adjacent human ancestors to the very edge of oblivion? Well, here's the uncomfortable truth. We can't point to one single villain with certainty, but the timing points hard in one direction, the climate. The clash lines up with a brutal turning point in Earth's history, a period when the planet's ice age cycles were shifting into a longer, harsher, more punishing rhythm. Ice sheets grew, global temperatures swung. In many regions, this meant long droughts, collapsing food supplies, and landscapes that could no longer feed the animals or the people that lived on them. Picture what that does to a species that lives directly off the land, with no farming, no stored grain, no safety net of any kind. The herds you hunt thin out and vanish. The plants you gather don't come back in the dry season. The rivers you depend on shrink into cracked mud. There's no moving to a better country because you don't know one exists, and every neighboring tribe is starving too. Populations don't need a dramatic, single disaster to collapse. They just need the math to tip. And when more people die each year than are born, and that continues generation after generation, the numbers grind downward relentlessly. A group of tens of thousands becomes thousands. Thousands become barely more than 1,000. And at that point, you're one bad century away from zero. That's the most likely story. Not a bang, but a long, grinding squeeze. A climate that turned against our ancestors and kept its grip for over 100,000 years, holding them at the very bottom, letting them survive, but not letting them thrive. But maybe you've heard a different version of humanity's near death, a more famous one, a more cinematic one, with a mountain that exploded and choked the sky. And it's worth telling because it shows how even science can fall in love with a story that might not be true. Around 74,000 years ago, a volcano erupted called Toba on the island of Sumatra. And not a normal eruption. One of the largest volcanic events in millions of years. It blasted an almost unimaginable volume of ash and rock into the atmosphere, enough to blanket huge parts of Asia in a layer of ash, and some argued to plunge the world into a years-long volcanic winter. For a long time, this became the go-to story for humanity's near extinction. The theory went like this. Toba erupted. The sky went dark. Temperatures crashed. Plants died, and the human population was slashed into a tiny remnant of survivors. Maybe just a few thousand people huddled in Africa. It was dramatic. It was terrifying. It fit the idea that one catastrophe reshaped our entire species overnight. And for years, it was repeated everywhere as fact. There's just one problem. The evidence has not held up well. When archaeologists actually dug at sites where humans were living around the time of the eruption, they found something awkward for the theory. Signs that people carried on. In parts of Africa and India, human toolmaking and life appear to continue right through the Toba event, without the collapse that the theory predicted. And many scientists now argue the global volcanic winter was far milder and shorter than the doomsday version everyone claimed. As one prominent researcher put it bluntly, the so-called Toba bottleneck simply may not have happened at all. So, here's the twist. The near extinction that's most famous, the exploding supervolcano, is the one the evidence increasingly says was overblown. And the near extinction that's real, the genuine one written in our DNA, happened hundreds of thousands of years earlier, quietly, with no single spectacular explosion to point to, no mountain to blame, just a slow, grinding crash that almost erased us. And that we only discovered because we have finally learned to read our own blood. The truth was less cinematic and far more chilling. We didn't nearly die in a bang. We nearly died in a slow, long silence. Now, here's where this ancient crash reaches out and touches your life directly. Look around at humanity. Different skin tones, different faces, different heights, different hair. We look incredibly varied to each other. We've built entire histories and borders and conflicts around those visible differences. But zoom out to the level of our actual genes, and something shocking appears. Humans are one of the least genetically varied large species on this planet. And here's a fact that stuns people every time. Two chimpanzees from a single troop in Africa can carry more genetic difference between them than two humans from opposite sides of the earth. All 8 billion of us, every culture, every continent, are genetically speaking remarkably, almost eerily similar. We are a young, tightly related species. In the deepest sense, we really are one family, and not a very big one. Why? Because we squeeze through those narrow moments. When a population crashes into a tiny number and then regrows, everyone who comes after inherits the limited genetic menu of those few survivors. The variety that would have existed in a large, ancient population was erased at that bottleneck. We didn't rebuild from millions of different lineages. We rebuilt from a handful. And that handful's fingerprint is stamped in all of us. So, next time you notice how different another person looks, hold this thought against it. Underneath the surface, the two of you are closer kin than two monkeys in the same tree. The differences we obsess over are a paper-thin layer over an almost identical foundation, a foundation laid by the same tiny group of survivors who refused to disappear. The near extinction didn't just almost end us. It shaped what kind of species we became. Unified, closely bound, all descended from the same desperate few. Every human alive is a cousin, because at one point, cousins were nearly all there was. Let's sit with the length of this, because it's the part the mind refuses to hold. 117,000 years. That is the estimated span our ancestors spent trapped at the bottom of that crash. To feel that number, compare it to us. Everything you think of as human history, the pyramids, every empire, every war, every book, every city, all of recorded time fits inside the last 5 or 6,000 years. Modern humans, our exact species, have only existed for around 300,000 years. Now, stretch that against 117,000 years of near extinction. Generation after generation was born, lived, and died in a world where the whole population never climbed out of that danger zone. Thousands of years passing, with humanity permanently on the edge, never safe, never numerous, always one disaster from the end. Children who never knew their species had ever been anything but rare. Elders who died having never seen a crowd. And through it all, somehow that fire stayed lit. Somebody always survived the drought. Somebody always had children who lived. Somebody always carried that knowledge forward. One more generation across 100,000 years of hardship without ever knowing they were the thin thread the entire future was hanging from. They had no idea they were special. They didn't know they were the survivors of anything, or that 8 billion descendants would one day exist because their particular tribe happened to not die out. They were just trying to make it through one more winter, and they did, barely. Again and again and again, long enough for the climate to finally ease, and for the numbers to slowly and quietly begin to climb. So, here's what you're actually made of. Every person you have ever loved, every stranger who has ever annoyed you in traffic, every leader, every artist, every enemy, every friend, all 8 billion of us are descendants of a small group that could fit in one room, a group that spent longer on the brink of extinction than our entire species has existed. We tell ourselves that humans are inevitable, that we were always destined to conquer the planet, to build cities, to reach the stars. But this is the fact that quietly destroys that story. We were not inevitable. For 100,000 years, we were an endangered animal, and we very nearly lost. That fragile tribe simply died out like so many others, and the Earth carried on for hundreds of thousands of years with no one to notice, and no one who could have ever been you. But that's not what happened. They held on through cold, through hunger, through a silence so long it's hard to even imagine. They held on. And the proof is not in a museum. The proof is listening to these words right now. You're not just alive. You are the far end of an unbroken chain of survivors that almost snapped 1,000,000 years ago, and somehow it never did. Every one of your ancestors, back through that entire crash, lived long enough to pass life forward, and not one of them failed. Not one. That's the inheritance hiding in your blood, not just a body. A survival story 900,000 years long, one that came terrifyingly close to having no end at all. But the thread held, and here you are.